Look at your hands. Look at your calendar. Look at the faint shadows beneath your eyes when the morning mirror forces you to face yourself. The fatigue is undeniable. The heaviness in your body is not imagined. You feel it in your shoulders, in your thoughts, in the quiet moments when your mind drifts toward a question you rarely allow yourself to ask. Why, after all this effort, are you still standing in the same place? Why does a year pass, then another, and the landscape of your life barely changes? Because from the moment you were old enough to understand instruction, you were taught a story. A story that sounded noble. A story that sounded honorable. A story that promised reward if only you were willing to endure more effort than the next person. Work harder, they said. Keep your head down. Sacrifice your comfort today so that success will eventually arrive tomorrow. The promise was simple: pain now, glory later. But reality is colder than the story. History does not reward those who simply work the hardest. History rewards those who control the system in which the work is done. Throughout centuries of human civilization, the most physically exhausted individuals were rarely the ones remembered as rulers. They were the ones constructing monuments, not the ones whose names were engraved upon them. They were the hands that lifted the stones, not the minds that designed the structure. And that uncomfortable realization produces a quiet anger inside many people. A feeling that the game may not be as fair as it was once described. The rules appear different when examined closely. The world does not distribute influence according to sweat. It distributes influence according to leverage. Effort alone generates friction. Strategy generates power. When someone spends every ounce of energy grinding through endless labor, their vision narrows. Their attention collapses toward the immediate task in front of them. Their head remains down, focused on the dirt beneath their feet, unable to observe the wider battlefield. And when you cannot see the landscape, you cannot see the traps that surround you. This is why exhaustion has always been useful to systems of control. A tired mind rarely questions its environment. A population that spends all its energy surviving rarely has the energy left to challenge the structure of the system itself. Fatigue narrows imagination. Fatigue silences curiosity. Fatigue keeps people obedient. True influence operates differently. Those who control outcomes maintain reserves of energy rather than spending themselves completely. They move slowly, speak calmly, and appear unhurried even when others around them rush in panic. Their stillness is not laziness. It is strategic preservation. Because strategy is born in quiet moments. When the noise of endless labor fades, the mind begins to observe patterns. It begins to ask questions others never ask. It begins to see how power actually moves beneath the surface of daily activity. In those moments, a person stops behaving like a tool and begins thinking like a designer. This is the critical divide between two types of individuals in every system. The first type carries the weight of endless tasks. They measure their value by how much they can endure. They believe sacrifice itself is a virtue. The second type measures value differently. They measure influence by how much control they possess over outcomes, resources, and decisions. The first group bleeds for the system. The second group shapes the system. Understanding this distinction is not comfortable. It forces you to confront the possibility that effort alone is not the ladder you were told it was. Effort is only valuable when it connects to leverage. Without leverage, effort becomes a slow drain on life itself. Energy is the most precious resource you possess, yet society often treats it as if it were infinite. People are encouraged to pour it endlessly into work, into obligations, into responsibilities that rarely return proportional reward. The message is repeated constantly: give more, push harder, sacrifice further. But very few people ask the most important question. Who benefits from that sacrifice? When you leave everything on the field, you return home with nothing left. No mental clarity, no creative energy, no strategic perspective. Just exhaustion. And exhaustion ensures that tomorrow you will return to the same routine without questioning it. This pattern is not accidental. It is structural. A person who conserves their energy begins to notice opportunities others overlook. They begin to analyze power relationships. They begin to ask who makes decisions and why those decisions shape the lives of everyone below them. The moment that awareness appears, the old belief system begins to crumble. Hard work, by itself, is not a virtue. Hard work without direction is merely movement. And movement without leverage leads nowhere. Consider the strange guilt that many people feel when they allow themselves to rest. An empty afternoon can produce anxiety, as if stillness itself were a violation of some invisible rule. The mind whispers accusations: you should be doing more, you should be producing something, you should be proving your worth through activity. This internal pressure did not appear naturally. It was cultivated. For generations, societies have reinforced the belief that suffering is evidence of moral virtue. The more difficult the struggle, the more noble the individual appears. The exhaustion itself becomes proof of dedication. People proudly describe how overwhelmed they are, how little sleep they get, how many responsibilities they carry. But exhaustion is not a badge of honor. It is often a sign that someone else is benefiting from your willingness to endure endless effort. In earlier eras of history, labor was never romanticized by those who held power. Those at the top did not celebrate the number of hours they worked. They celebrated their influence, their alliances, their ability to move resources and people with a single decision. Work was a necessity for survival, but it was never mistaken for authority. Today, the narrative has reversed. Productivity is worshipped as if it were the ultimate virtue. Yet beneath that narrative lies a quiet paradox: the individuals with the greatest influence rarely appear rushed. They have time. Time to observe. Time to think. Time to plan. Time is the clearest indicator of control. When someone must constantly prove their usefulness through endless tasks, they remain trapped in the role of a tool. Tools are valuable only while they are being used. When they wear down, they are replaced without hesitation. This truth can feel harsh, but understanding it is liberating. Systems do not operate on sentiment. Systems operate on function. If someone is easily replaceable, the system will eventually replace them. Which leads to another uncomfortable reality. Competence can become a trap. When a person demonstrates extraordinary ability in performing difficult tasks, they are rewarded with more of those tasks. Their reputation grows as someone who can handle anything. Managers rely on them. Colleagues depend on them. Responsibilities accumulate until their entire identity revolves around carrying burdens others cannot carry. But the more essential they become to the workload, the less likely they are to escape it. The system does not promote its strongest laborers into positions where they would stop producing that labor. It keeps them exactly where their output is most useful. This is why intelligent restraint becomes necessary. Not every skill should be perfected. Not every problem should be solved by the same individual. Sometimes the wisest move is allowing others to carry responsibilities that would otherwise trap you. It requires confidence to step back from tasks that appear impressive but offer little leverage. It requires patience to resist the urge to prove yourself constantly. But restraint creates space for something far more powerful: strategic thinking. The difference between brute force and strategy has been observed across centuries of human conflict. Raw strength can overwhelm obstacles temporarily, but cunning often bypasses obstacles entirely. The individual who understands systems rarely needs to exert maximum effort. They apply effort precisely where it produces disproportionate results. This principle defines leverage. Leverage separates effort from outcome. A person can exhaust themselves performing thousands of repetitive actions and still achieve minimal progress if their direction is wrong. Meanwhile, a single well-timed decision, conversation, or investment can produce results that multiply far beyond the effort required. This asymmetry exists everywhere in life. The most valuable skill is not the ability to work endlessly. The most valuable skill is the ability to identify the few actions that reshape entire systems. Once someone understands this principle, their relationship with work changes dramatically. They begin asking different questions. Where does influence originate? Who controls the decision points? What knowledge is hidden within everyday operations? Observation becomes more important than speed. A quiet observer learns the mechanics of the environment around them. They study how organizations acquire customers, how reputations are shaped, how incentives influence behavior. What once appeared as random activity begins to reveal patterns. Every workplace, every market, every social system operates according to invisible rules. Those rules determine who rises and who remains stuck performing the same labor year after year. The individual who studies those rules gains a subtle advantage. Instead of exhausting themselves chasing immediate recognition, they begin building long-term leverage. They treat their current environment as a classroom rather than a permanent destination. Every process becomes a lesson. Every decision reveals information about how power flows within the system. Gradually, a blueprint begins forming in their mind. And that blueprint represents something far more powerful than effort alone. Imagine a vast structure rising toward the sky. Hundreds of workers climb across beams and scaffolding, welding steel and securing bolts while the wind pushes against them. Their labor is real. Their sweat is undeniable. Every floor of the building exists because of their effort. Yet somewhere else, perhaps in a quiet office far from the noise of construction, another individual studies a sheet of paper covered in lines and measurements. That person is not lifting steel. They are not risking their life on a narrow beam high above the ground. They are holding a blueprint. The builders construct the structure piece by piece. The architect designed the structure before the first beam was lifted. When the project ends, the workers move on to the next construction site. The architect's name remains permanently attached to the building. The difference between those roles is not measured in hours of labor. It is measured in perspective. One role executes instructions. The other creates them. Many people spend their entire lives perfecting the art of carrying bricks without ever questioning who designed the building. They assume that if they carry enough bricks long enough, someone will eventually hand them the blueprint. But designing a structure requires a different mindset entirely. It requires stepping back from the bricks. It requires observing the entire system from a higher vantage point. Instead of asking how to work harder within the structure, the architect asks why the structure exists at all and how it could be redesigned. This shift in perspective transforms how a person approaches their life. They stop measuring success by how exhausted they feel at the end of the day. They begin measuring success by how much influence they gain over the systems that shape their future. Energy becomes something to manage rather than something to spend freely. When effort is applied carefully, it accumulates pressure like water held behind a dam. That pressure becomes useful only when released at the right moment. If the dam breaks prematurely, the water floods the land and disappears. But when directed through turbines, the same water produces enormous power. Human energy works the same way. When someone gives everything constantly, their impact becomes diluted. When someone withholds effort strategically, their actions become unpredictable and therefore more powerful. Scarcity creates value. The same principle applies to attention, presence, and time. If someone is always available, their presence becomes ordinary. If someone appears only when their contribution matters most, their influence grows. People notice absence. They notice restraint. They begin to assign greater importance to each action. This is not manipulation. It is simply an understanding of human perception. Value increases when something is rare. For many individuals, the hardest obstacle to overcome is pride. Years of struggle create an identity built around endurance. They become proud of how much they can suffer. They compare their hardships to the comfort of others and use the comparison to feel morally superior. But pride in suffering does not produce leverage. It merely makes the burden easier to tolerate. Releasing that identity requires humility. It requires acknowledging that the system does not reward effort in proportion to sacrifice. It rewards those who learn how to position themselves where effort multiplies results. Once that realization settles in, a new path appears. A person no longer seeks validation through endless labor. They seek knowledge, leverage, and ownership. They still work, but their work serves a larger strategy. Each step moves them closer to independence from the systems that once controlled them. Gradually, the role shifts. The individual who once carried the heaviest load begins designing systems of their own. They invest in assets rather than trading time endlessly. They build networks that extend their influence beyond their physical presence. They develop knowledge that allows them to direct energy instead of merely supplying it. The transformation is rarely dramatic. It happens quietly, often unnoticed by those still trapped in the rhythm of constant activity. But over time the difference becomes impossible to ignore. One life remains defined by effort. The other becomes defined by leverage. And once someone experiences that shift, the old belief in endless grinding begins to look like what it always was, a story designed to keep the builders busy while someone else writes their name on the plaque.